Thank you. My study is understanding dilemma and decision making through literature. I serve as associate professor and department chair of leadership studies, adult education, and school administration at North Carolina A&T State University. I am in the business of preparing leaders to go out into the world and really change it for all the better, whether it is through K-12 nonprofits, universities, businesses, what have you. And so I decided to focus on this because my background is in English as well as educational leadership. So when we go through this, I'll focus on the story of how I really got to this. Why in the world I'm focusing on dilemma and and sort of conflict resolution. What multiculturalism has to do with all of this, the frameworks, and then sort of a charge for moving forward as we think about different ways to just teach leaders to go out into the world. So when I think about my past, when it comes to understanding leadership, especially within literature, I often think of the Disney concept, sort of that old school Disney concept, especially in the US, and how those old school Disney movies, which I still love, sort of presented childhood in one way. And it presented childhood as this fun, magical place, sort of a nuclear household. You had siblings. More than likely, your family was of one particular economic class, as well as one particular race and cultural background. And as I began looking at literature in terms of using fiction, nonfiction, any sort of genre, as to how we teach leadership, I started doing some background research on what's often used. And on one hand, I love the literature that is often used. I think of one that keeps popping up being John Steinbeck's books and different things like that. But what I noticed was that when it came to the students that I teach, and when it came to the professional communities that I'm in, the ones of us who are in leadership and dealing with conflict and dealing with issues every day we are not represented in the literature that's often out there. And so when I think of one particular study, I think of a study done by Martin, Edwards, and Sayers in 2018, where they looked at over 52 different pieces of literature that's often used in business and management and leadership courses. And out of those 52 pieces of literature, less than 6 were written by women. Out of those 4 or 5, 2 of them written by women had male protagonists. And then there were no studies as to what the cultural background, religious background, disability, ability, gender, anything like that as it relates to the protagonist. So that got me thinking some more about how exactly can we use multicultural literature to help understand what leadership really looks like, especially when looking at how diverse the US is becoming and continues to become. So I decided to really deal with this concept of dilemma. How exactly is it navigated? What does it look like? How exactly do we come to these conclusions? And so I found that using dilemma in literature allows readers to analyze how leaders navigate tough situations and arrive at complex solutions. Experts have proven that leadership qualities and abilities can be seen through fictional and non-fictional characters. So we've known for a while, especially in leadership studies, that fiction and nonfiction can be used to better understand what leadership looks like and how it works. So my argument from there is, let's go a little deeper into using different cultural books in order to understand what leadership looks like among different groups. So in the books that I'm going to present to you for this study, I analyzed about 20, but for this presentation, I'm really only going to focus on 3. And so the protagonists are all women. They come from different backgrounds. I did this on purpose. And the women presented in the book completely contrast with society's notion, especially in the US, of how women should be. So things such as meek, quiet, well-mannered, subservient, caring for family, as that being the role. And so while a lot of these characters within the novels begin that way, we do find that they quickly change. As they become more aware of their identities and as they become aware of the power of their own voices, their leadership characteristics also change. And so that's something that's important to pay attention to, especially when we think of teaching undergraduate and graduate students who are trying to understand different leadership concepts. And so the two frameworks I chose to focus on is multicultural feminism, and that thinking more in terms of how the voices and the experiences of a diverse group of women contribute to society and influence change. So taking from that standpoint, multicultural feminism, and then social change theory, and especially the aspects of social change theory within leadership that says leaders are supposed to be socially responsible. They're supposed to be collaborative. They understand that leadership is a process, it's not a one-time thing. It is not simply the title of your position, but it is something that changes over time. And then understanding that leadership should be diverse and also accessible. So using those two frameworks and understanding that leadership is supposed to show us numerous possibilities, I focused on these three works. So as I said, in the study, I focused on about 20 different works, but I in particular pulled out these three, honestly, because that's what we're discussing in the classes I'm teaching right now. So it is fresh on the brain. So one being The Personal Librarian, written by Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murphy, telling the story of Belle DaCosta Green, who we see as this woman who is passing for white. And, you know, unlike Nella Larson's passing, where it can almost be seen as selfish and seen for personal gain, in this particular book, Belle DaCosta Green, we see her conflict from the very first page unto the last page, where she is constantly wondering, do I continue to pass as white to actually benefit the African-American community and my family and this work of being a librarian, or do I finally come out as African-American, and then what would the backlash be for that? And so we see the constant struggle. Within Time of the Butterflies, we see protests, and we see what grassroots leadership really looks like. And we also see the conflict, especially that women have, of having to choose, you know, do I do this particular thing to better my family and better my community, or do I go back and actually take care of my family, take care of my children in a completely different way? So there's another type of conflict that we see within that book that students can really pick and choose from, but also analyze deeply. And then with The Four Winds, I pulled out Elsa Martinelli, who we know at the beginning of the story starts off as a wealthy white woman living with her family, gets pregnant, her family sort of casts her to the side. She marries the boy that she was seeing at that time, who is an Italian immigrant, aligns with their family, gets raised on this farm, and then we know the Dust Bowl of the 1930s comes. And so she has to decide, you know, my husband who has left me and my children, do we try to follow him and get a more prosperous life, or do we stay here? And underneath this, also understanding that this is from the perspective of one particular character, where historically the Dust Bowl, other racial minorities had different experiences when it came from that. So through all of these three books, we're able to look at how, number one, how women are affected when it comes to dilemmas and making these types of personal decisions. And also, what exactly do they face, and how can we use that for current situations when we're talking about leading organizations and realizing that a one-size-fits-all approach to leadership doesn't actually work. So the takeaways that we can get from these particular stories is that, one, emotions can be good. It fits within multicultural feminism. It also fits within the social change theory that emotions are good. As a leader, you do not have to remain stoic at all times. And emotions actually contribute to how we make decisions and how we wrestle with making decisions. The next is that leadership can be collaborative and it can be community-based. Oftentimes, especially in the US, we see among women and among racial minorities that organizations and businesses that are often launched by these groups are community and needs-based. And that is not a bad thing. It's not always about gaining the $1 million when it comes to the company, but that leadership can be that. That directly flows into focusing on the greater good with all of the protagonists within the book, but also thinking about what leadership could be or should be. It is not for self. It is, what is your legacy? What is that lasting thing that you're going to put out there that will benefit others? And then the fourth is that leadership looks different based on difference. It looks different if you're a woman. It looks different if you're a racial minority. It looks different if you were brought up under a different class scale. It looks different if you are short. It looks different, if you have some sort of disability. Leadership looks different depending on who you are. And so my final charge is, especially when it comes to classes and when it comes to teaching, to really use multicultural literature to help students understand leadership and other aspects from different perspectives, and to make sure to diversify the curriculum. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.